20 dispatch, I'm arriving.
Something happened, causing the vehicle to veer left into the parking lot.
He had actually been shot in the face.
The most serious crime that we could ever prosecute in our office.
Not knowing just made me feel helpless.
It doesn't get much better than after the crime, an individual looking directly into a camera.
"51-year-old Jorge Rodriguez is planning Independence Day celebrations with daughter Darlene. But she has a special reason to take it easy.
I was pregnant, and I didn't always feel well.
No, esta noche no.
No te preocupas.
Now, I know it's 4th of July and everything, but the last thing I want to do is go see fireworks.
No. Ay, mija, qué precioso.
Amber showing him the little ultrasound, and he was so happy.
Para qué buen salud que será un varón.
He's like, it better be a boy.
Jorge is father to 3 girls.
Family was just everything to my dad. He was just always there for us. I was asking if we needed anything.
When I think of my dad, I just think of like someone really caring and loving.
My dad was a field worker, picking apples or picking cherries, just depended on the season. Everyone loved my dad. My dad was always that person that wanted to help you. His smile was just contagious.
Jorge needs groceries for the family celebrations.
Mira, iba a tener algo comer. ¿Quieres algo que te vayas?
He told me I'm gonna go to Fiesta Foods. It's a supermarket here in town, and pick up some stuff so I can cook dinner. And I was like, okay, I'll see you later.
Ciao.
Bye.
This is 911. Do you need an ambulance?
Yeah, some guy just got shot in the face or something like that. We're on Lewis Street.
Okay, and what happened?
He's running right now. He's bleeding. I mean, he's stopping traffic, but I don't know if there's something wrong. Okay, I got it. We'll get somebody dispatched over there.
It was July 4th. There's always 1 or 2 injuries related to fireworks on a night like that.
20 dispatch, I'm arriving. 15 Lewis.
So it's not uncommon to get a call where we're assisting our Pasco medics.
Officers, what happened here? Sir, you shouldn't be standing. We're going to get you some medical attention, okay?
He had obvious significant injuries to his face.
All right, hang in there. We're going to get you some help, okay?
It became clear right away to me that it was not fireworks. Instead, he had actually been shot in the face. At least 1 time, if not twice.
All right, what's the ETA for the medics?
A couple of minutes away.
All right, hang in there, sir. Help's going to be here soon, okay?
Someone called me with my dad's cell phone, and they're like, is this Darlene? I think your dad just got shot. Got in my car and I drove over there.
Who's this?
Please, that's my dad.
Yes, I can't let you.
Please,
Sorry,
I need to see him.
The victim's daughter arrived on scene and was obviously very emotional.
That's my dad.
I know this isn't easy. Please, let the medics celebrate.
I was just in utter shock with the whole thing. I was crying and screaming.
She told us that the male that we were dealing with was her father, Jorge Rodriguez.
I need to see him.
He needs medical attention.
The police officer was holding me back.
No, you don't understand.
My dad's right there. He's like, I'm sorry, you cannot go over there. He was holding his cheek like this, and he was telling me, like, to calm down.
Paramedics rush Jorge to the nearest hospital.
We have such great medicine and good hospitals and good doctors, but I've seen people get much less severe injuries and die from them.
Dad got shot.
I got the phone call from my sister, and she was like crying hysterically.
What's happening? How did it happen? You know, like where? What was he doing? It was hard to believe at first.
We're gonna go to the hospital. I'll meet you there.
With Jorge in a critical condition and unable to speak, police must piece together the events of the night without him.
Everything's chaotic at that point. So my job and responsibility is to gather that information, filter out the irrelevant things, and get just the most basic details that I need.
What kind of vehicle was he driving?
Jorge's daughter had been able to tell us that Jorge had been out in his black Cadillac Escalade and had been driving through Pasco.
Yeah, I saw a car take off. It actually took off.
One of the males that was at the scene told us that Jorge said his vehicle had crashed, and he pointed eastward down the street from where we were standing. I was able to follow a trail that Jorge had left on the pavement with his blood and walked a couple of 100 yards east to the Los Pinos parking lot, where I found the vehicle his daughter had described. The vehicle had crashed into several parked cars and through a fence that surrounded the restaurant. As I'm walking up to the Cadillac, I noticed a bullet hole in the rear driver's side window, and I noticed inside of the car was covered in blood.
Watch out for the blood here.
Where's it coming from?
Over here. So he crawled out.
Veteran Pasco detective Jesse Romero arrives at the crash site.
The fact that the vehicle had blood inside and that it also wrecked, your natural progression of facts would be that whatever happened in the vehicle caused that vehicle to wreck. So more likely than not, somebody got shot inside the vehicle. It went into like a embankment, so the wheels of the vehicle were off the ground. They were not having traction. The time of day was almost 11 o'clock. It's more of a commercial area. So we didn't have witnesses there. We started observing the entire scene, looking for cameras.
At the Los Pinos restaurant, there were 2 surveillance cameras that were covering the parking lot and pointing north toward Lewis Street and the intersection of 14th and Lewis.
Our first instinct is hopefully to capture the incident.
Romero, this is Jose. He owns the place.
Jose?
Detectives call in the restaurant owner.
The owner of the restaurant, Los Pinos, arrived.
Are your security cameras working?
We informed him what had happened. He mentioned that he did have video.
Let's go.
He escorted us downstairs to where his security cameras were. We're trying to see if we could see Jorge's vehicle.
Can you start from 10 p.m., please?
Cameras can paint a very good picture of what actually took place before we arrived.
That's the SUV. Play it again. Can you switch to the second camera, please? Play it again. It's lost control. Switch back to the first camera.
Something happened, causing the vehicle to veer left into the parking lot, and then it wrecked.
It crashed into the fence line and came in contact with one of these cars in this used car lot that was next door to the restaurant.
Rewind. Zoom in.
You see an individual exit the vehicle, go on the passenger side. You see our driver exit the vehicle. We knew the vehicle had blood inside.
Rewind. Zoom in. Play it again. Do you see that?
We saw what we believed to be a gunshot coming from inside the vehicle, with our suspect shooting our victim.
Switch back to the Lewis Street camera.
You see Jorge Rodriguez. You see him confused, dazed, going northbound onto Lewis Street in the middle of the roadway.
Rewind. Can you switch to the second camera, please? Rewind it.
The suspect goes back into the vehicle, attempts to drive off in the vehicle. The wheels of the vehicle were not touching the ground, so therefore the vehicle was not able to move. He exits the vehicle again and travels northbound.
Switch back to the first camera. Play it again.
The suspect ultimately crossed the street directly across from the Los Pinos, and eventually it goes into the darkness. So you lose exactly the direction of travel.
Play it again.
Romero searches for the clearest view of the suspect.
You see our offender come around along the restaurant.
Is it there?
He looks directly into the camera. Our suspect was a Hispanic male. He was shorter, stocky build. He was probably late teens, early 20s. We noticed that he did place his hands in front of his pants, which is an indicator that he had something there that he was trying to retain. More likely not, it was probably the weapon used in the crime.
The shell casings that were recovered were not very common. This was a .32 caliber weapon.
From the video and having the close-up on our suspect and releasing the picture, we are hoping that this individual has some sort of dealings with other law enforcement agencies in the area, at which case he would be identified.
The family of Jorge Rodriguez gather at the hospital.
The doctor told us that they had put him in an induced coma. It was horrible. I had never seen him like that. My dad was always so strong and alive. Just to see him lay there like that just broke my heart.
It was just like a numb feeling. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what to feel.
I just remember, like, crying on my mom's shoulder. Like, what if he dies? What are we gonna do?
They just kept telling me we can hope for the best, but We can't really make you any promises.
Detective Romero explores the idea that as the killer was in the car, he may have known Jorge.
Do you recognize this man at all?
It's really important to talk to the family because you get background information.
Did your dad have any enemies?
You get to know whether they have any problems with anybody.
I told him no, I don't think anyone would want to hurt my dad. My dad was so nice to everybody that I couldn't even imagine that.
But he did have some money issues.
She did mention that Jorge did owe money to people. That was concerning to us. Because at that point, we were thinking, well, maybe one of those people might have been the ones that did him harm.
The following morning, investigators find a name of interest.
We looked at Jorge's phone, and we could see there was quite a few calls made to a person he had in his contacts as Gordo. That made a high priority for us, thinking that this is the person that committed this crime. We need to locate Gordo to see if his appearance matched what we had on our video footage.
Hi, I'm Detective Romero, Pasco PD.
His appearance was different to the suspect.
Can you tell me what's your relationship with Mr. Rodriguez?
It's not him. It was determined that Gordo had no part in the crime. So we went back to the security cameras to possibly develop leads in that way.
Detective Romero returns to retrace the suspect's escape route.
From the video, we knew that he ran northbound away from Los Pinos restaurant. Where our victim was going westbound, our suspect fled northbound.
Further CCTV might help track the suspect.
We're looking at other video security cameras from other businesses.
He finds a camera pointing to an alley north of the crash site.
We're trying to see the path in general that he took away from the crime scene so we can better explain his actions after committing the crime.
Romero scans the footage from the time of the crash.
Maybe he left a vehicle nearby that we might be able to track. Sometimes you'll even have a better image of the individual as well.
Where is he?
As we watch, you don't actually see him.
I feel like we'd lost him. Let's go back to before the crash.
Romero checks the footage in the lead-up to the shooting.
Freeze it there.
And then you see our suspect.
Freeze it there. Can you replay it?
The person was traveling eastbound, wearing tennis shoes, khaki pants, a white T-shirt.
Walking with the same mannerisms as observed on those other video footages.
That looks like him.
We were able to locate where he was at before he actually committed the crime.
Where's he going?
Investigators were going through the various businesses and trying to retrace steps of a likely path of travel.
We were able to locate a video camera from Accounting Solutions. We also noticed another camera that was pointing in a south direction away from the business. We're trying to see if we can get a clear shot of his face that would be easier for us to identify.
Romero cues the footage up to half an hour before the crash.
Come on. There you are.
You can clearly identify our suspect is wearing the same clothing in much better detail than Los Pinos. But we weren't able to get a clear shot of his face.
Romero cues up the footage from the second camera.
In the Accounting Solutions video, you see our suspect approach that vehicle.
This particular vehicle looked to be like a large truck or some SUV type of vehicle. The individual goes right up to the driver's side door.
He's trying to steal a car.
For whatever reason, he doesn't seem to pursue it. And he continued to walk away from that vehicle. And we lose coverage from that camera angle.
It was not the same type of vehicle as Jorge's vehicle,
but it was a similar vehicle.
he was looking basically to carjack somebody.
With Jorge in a medically induced coma, doctors are still unsure if he'll survive.
Not knowing just made me feel helpless. And at the time, I felt like I had to be strong for my mom. Because she kept asking me what's happening, is he okay? And I'm like, they're not telling me anything. And I remember her telling me, don't lie to me. You know, like, I'm not. You know, it was really hard.
Now that Detective Romero suspects the crime was a carjack, he focuses on where the attacker could have made his move.
Inside the vehicle was also a grocery bag from Fiesta Foods with items that were recently purchased by Jorge, which coincided with what Darlene had told us with him being at Fiesta Foods earlier in the night. Knowing that most stores have really good video systems, we were hoping that we were going to be able to determine whether he was alone or not.
Romero heads to Fiesta Foods. If the attacker did target Jorge here, the internal cameras could be the best chance of an identifiable image.
Okay. Can you start from 10 p.m., please? There he is. Play it again.
You see Jorge at the counter purchasing the items. He paid cash. Everything seemed normal. There was no signs of any fear. He did have a brief conversation with the cashier.
He did not appear to be in distress. He did not appear to be looking around as if someone was following him.
It looked like Jorge was there alone.
Can you show me the other camera angle? Freeze it. There he is.
He's pacing back and forth, kind of keeping an eye on people.
Freeze it.
He appears to be looking for a target.
That was all at the same time when Jorge was at the register. We really needed to get this person identified. As the days go by after the actual crime, the chance of recovering any usable evidence from that crime diminishes with the expiration of each day.
Zoom in.
The footage is clear, but the overhead angle means the suspect's face is still hidden.
The camera was just not placed correctly to where we would have been able to see the suspect complete. It was definitely frustrating. We always wanted to get justice for our victims. We want to prevent him from doing any further crimes or hurting anybody else.
Wait, look. What's that on his t-shirt?
We saw the insignia on our suspect's t-shirt. We were able to identify that logo as the Dallas Cowboys.
Two days after releasing the CCTV image of the suspect, police finally get a breakthrough.
Yep.
Romero, check your email.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
We received a tip from an anonymous source.
This person identified the suspect. So that began the process of law enforcement narrowing their focus on this particular person, Pedro Cadenas.
Pedro Cadenas, a 17-year-old with a criminal past, already has an active arrest warrant out for a misdemeanor.
We were able to obtain a photograph from Juvenile. We compared the photo that we sent out from the video, and the likeness was strong.
Not only did they provide who they believed the suspect was, but then they provided some key information saying this individual is known to use a .32 caliber pistol.
We had a .32 caliber spent casing at the scene. That was information not provided to the public or anybody else.
By having those shell casings and being able to verify and know that that caliber was a match, that was absolutely critical.
In our estimates, it was one and the same. Now, at this point, we have to locate Pedro.
Yep.
Romero receives information on where Cadenas may be hiding out.
I'll do. Thank you.
His girlfriend was living in Sunnyside. We got our crew together. We had to coordinate with the Sunnyside Police Department the DLC officer that was supervising Pedro, and our street crimes unit, and we all headed over to begin surveillance.
The team prepares to take Cadenas down as soon as he surfaces.
Go, go, go. Go. Go, go, go. Go.
Hands on your head. Hands on your head. Keep coming. Keep coming. Stop. On your knees. On your knees.
He gave no resistance. There was a sense of relief. Once Pedro was arrested, he was taken over to the Sunnyside Police Department.
Investigators asked Cadenas where he was on the night of the murder.
I wasn't even in Pasco that night. We have a video that shows you where.
Although he matched the description of the person on video, his appearance was slightly different. He invoked his Miranda rights. Therefore, I was not able to continue my interview with them.
Police are now in a race against time.
At this point, we're under a time crunch to develop probable cause. We only had 24 hours.
Without more evidence, Cadenas could go free.
It was going to be crucial to have the details necessary for us to be able to charge Pedro. His likelihood of fleeing the area would be great if he was released.
Detectives convince another individual who knows Pedro Cadenas to talk anonymously.
You give us the details about Pedro's actions on the 4th of July, and we can help you.
I still think there was a sense of apprehension. They knew he had criminal history.
They confirmed that Pedro was at a party in Pasco and that Pedro had left the party and later had returned bloodied. They provided his clothing description that he was wearing the day of the incident. They told us that it was a Dallas Cowboys t-shirt that he was wearing, matching up with security video. At that moment, I knew that we had Pedro. We still had to do additional interviews and follow-up, but we had enough to charge Pedro with the crime of assault first degree.
At the hospital, Jorge Rodriguez clings to life.
For a couple hours, they would come and check his brain activity. And that's when they told me he's not waking up.
The activity in his brain was just getting lower and lower, so that's when I thought, like, yeah, it's just probably his time.
Me and my mom, we just made sure to hold his hand and just like rub his arm, make him feel comfortable. Like, we'll be okay. My mom's gonna take care of me and my sisters.
Three weeks after the shooting, Jorge Rodriguez succumbs to his injuries.
We amended the charges to eventually charge Pedro Cadenas with murder in the first degree, not attempted murder.
In court, Cadenas continues to deny that he was the shooter. But the multiple sightings of him on CCTV and confidential witness testimony is enough to convince jurors that he was inside Jorge's vehicle. Pedro Cadenas is sentenced to 36 years and 2 months for first-degree murder and attempted theft of a motor vehicle. The security footage lays bare the full tragic events of that night.
Pedro was looking basically to carjack somebody. He was looking for a target. The fact that Jorge paid in cash at Fiesta Foods with a large dollar bill, the fact that he's also driving a fancy car, that made the right person for Pedro to target.
Who the hell are you? Shut up, just shut up.
As he's leaving Fiesta Foods, he entered Jorge's vehicle.
Leave me alone, I got nothing here, man. Shut up.
As Jorge is driving westbound on Lewis Street, an argument ensues.
What are you doing? What are you doing?
Which causes Jorge to lose control of his vehicle. Moments later, Pedro freaks out for whatever reason, shooting Jorge. Then he fled the scene.
It was the video coverage that allowed us to show the jury the callousness of the crime, to show that this individual premeditated this. And he ultimately found the car that Jorge was driving that night to be the type of car that he liked, the type of car that he wanted. We asked for a fairly high sentence because just the callousness of doing this crime solely to want to take this person's vehicle, it was a horrific crime.
I don't think he was remorseful at all. We would have had our dad if it wasn't for his decisions.
It's hard to believe he's not here anymore.
I don't forget it. When the 4th of July comes, I try to have fun, you know. I try to go out and just do regular 4th of July things, but it's just always at the top of my head.
He was the type of person where he would have $1 and he would literally just give you 99 cents out of it. He would always tell me, like, look after your sisters. And that's really what we've been doing.
My dad never missed a chance to tell me how beautiful I was, or like how proud he was of me. I wish I would have told him the same.
In a cruel twist of fate, tragedy soon hits Darlene and her sisters again.
My mom, she had pancreatic cancer. She's literally dying from it. And we were too focused on, what Pedro did to my dad that we didn't have time to focus on my mom.
Just 15 months after Cadenas murdered Jorge, the girls lose their mother, too.
I do blame him for it. I blame him because if we were going through all of this with my dad, we could have caught her cancer sooner. She might still be here. This whole situation makes me feel cold-hearted sometimes because I feel nothing for this man.
Before losing her mother, Darlene gave birth to a baby girl. She would have been Jorge's first granddaughter.
He would have been a great...
The clock in the small town of Oak Haven stopped at 11:42 p.m. on a Tuesday in the autumn of 1996. the exact moment the life of 19-year-old Clara Vance was violently and irrevocably erased from the map of the living. It wasn't just a disappearance. It was a vanishing act that defied the laws of physics and logic, leaving behind nothing but a shattered headlight on a desolate stretch of Route 9 and a town that would spend the next 3 decades looking over its shoulder. The air in Oak Haven still tastes like damp earth and old secrets, a persistent, metallic tang that reminds anyone who breathes it in that some voids never truly close. Clara was the girl who had everything: the scholarship to the state university, the radiant smile that appeared in every yearbook photograph, and the quiet, unassuming grace that made her the darling of the valley. Yet in the blink of an eye, she became the central figure in a cold case mystery that would define the darkest hours of a generation. The search began with the frantic, uncoordinated energy of a community fueled by fear, with neighbors turning on neighbors and the local police struggling to pin down a suspect in a landscape that seemed determined to keep its secrets. For years, the case file remained a heavy, yellowing monument to failure, a collection of dead-end leads, retracted witness statements, and the ghost of a man seen fleeing the scene in a rusted sedan that vanished into the thick, impenetrable fog of the surrounding woods. It was a cold case that froze the very marrow of the town, creating a culture of suspicion where parents kept their children indoors and the silence of the forest became a source of constant, low-level terror. The breakthrough didn't come from a genius detective or a groundbreaking forensic miracle. It came from the digital age's relentless, encroaching light, a stroke of digital providence that caught a man who had spent 30 years hiding in the shadows of a new name and a synthetic life. Silas Thorne, the man who had been the primary person of interest in 1996, had simply walked out of Oak Haven and ceased to be, rebranding himself across 3 different states, burying his past under a mountain of aliases and calculated anonymity. But the modern dragnet, a web of biometric surveillance, interconnected database queries, and the sheer, algorithmic persistence of the law, finally snagged him in a sun-drenched suburb of Phoenix, where he had been living the quiet, unremarkable life of a retired high school teacher. The arrest, when it finally arrived, was a jarring collision of the past and the present, a cinematic moment of reckoning that shattered the peace of 1,000 sunrises. When the agents kicked down his door, they weren't just arresting an old man. They were arresting the ghost of 1996, the phantom that had haunted Oak Haven for 3 decades, and the look on his face wasn't one of surprise, but of profound, weary resignation, as if he had been expecting this knock since the moment he turned his back on that broken headlight in the dark. The suspect had been caught. The 30-year run was over, but the questions remained, festering in the back of everyone's mind. How does a man commit an act of such cold, calculated malice, and then simply go back to teaching, to grading papers, to being a pillar of a different community, while the blood of his first victim was still theoretically drying in the soil of his past? The legal proceedings that followed were a grueling, visceral descent into the heart of a sociopath, a process of stripping away the veneer of the teacher to reveal the predator underneath. The courtroom was a theater of agony where the fragments of a broken past were pieced back together with cold, scientific precision, each day an excavation of a life that had been fundamentally altered by a single night of violence. Every piece of evidence, the fibers, the geolocation data, the frantic letters he had sent to himself during his time on the run, painted a portrait of a man obsessed with the mechanics of his own escape, a man who had treated the entire continent as his private, temporary sanctuary. The trial became a ritual, a way for Oak Haven to finally exhale, to look into the eyes of the man who had stolen their peace, and demand an answer, even if the answer was as hollow as the man himself. But even with the cuffs on and the verdict read, the case feels unresolved in the most profound sense, because you can catch a killer, you can bring a man to justice, but you can't bring back the 19-year-old girl who had her whole life ahead of her, and you can't erase the 3 decades of fear that the town lived through. The ghost of Clara Vance still wanders the halls of the Oak Haven courthouse, a silent, spectral presence that reminds everyone that while the mystery is technically solved, the tragedy is an infinite, repeating loop. The town has been forced to reckon with the reality that evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes, It wears the face of a teacher, a neighbor, a person you see at the post office every morning, a realization that is far more terrifying than any urban legend ever told in the woods. As the media circus packs up and the news cycle moves on to the next, fresher horror, the people of Oakhaven are left with the silence again, but it's a different kind of silence now, a silence of finality, of a wound that has finally been exposed to the light. The arrest of Silas Thorne was the end of a long, dark road, but it was not a return to the way things were, because the way things were was the very environment that allowed him to get away, and that's a truth that no amount of justice can ever fully address. The investigators are heading home, the files are being archived, and the name Clara Vance is being moved from the missing posters to the historical record, a permanent, tragic fixture of the town's collective memory. But the questions keep coming, kept alive by the realization that 30 years is a long time to live with a lie, and the fact that he was finally caught doesn't answer the most basic, human question of all. Why? Why her? Why then? Why did he throw it all away for a moment of violence that had no purpose, no gain, no meaning? The trial has concluded. The suspect is in a cage. The cold case is warm with the light of the verdict, yet the void is still there, a crater in the center of Oakhaven that can't be filled by a conviction. People walk the streets and look at the trees and remember the night the headlight shattered, and they know that justice is just a word, a formal, bureaucratic end to a story that has no real closure, no real healing, only the cold, hard, definitive reality of a man who spent 30 years running from himself and finally had nowhere left to go. The investigation has peeled back the skin of the town and shown the bones of their past, and now that they can see the bones, they realize that the structure of their reality was never as sound as they thought it was. The ghost of the girl and the shadow of the man are now locked in the final chapter of a story that has taken an entire generation to write, a story that will be the subject of documentaries, of podcasts, of late-night whispers for as long as people live in the valley. They are finally free of the mystery, but they are haunted by the truth, and there is no detective, no court, and no verdict that can ever clear the fog from the woods of Oakhaven. The case is closed, the chapter is finished, and the nightmare is over, but the town is still standing in the ruins, and they know that the truth is just the beginning of the rest of their lives. The extraction of Silas Thorne from his carefully manicured life in Phoenix was the seismic event that finally cracked the vault of 1996. When the federal agents breached his residence, they weren't just taking a suspect into custody, they were collapsing a 30-year house of cards, a meticulously engineered reality constructed from the debris of a ruined life. Inside that home, the atmosphere felt like a vacuum, a place where time had been held in a state of suspended animation. The walls were lined not with the photos of a life lived, but with the hollow, antiseptic remnants of a man who had been practicing the art of being nobody. It was a home of extreme minimalism, a calculated, aggressive void designed to ensure that if the law ever did come knocking, there would be nothing to tell his story. Yet, even in his desperation to erase himself, the habits of the predator were etched into the very architecture of his existence. Hidden beneath the floorboards of his walk-in closet, tucked away in a series of lead-lined, fireproof lockboxes, investigators found the real narrative of his 30-year flight. It wasn't just a collection of IDs, dozens of them, representing a sprawling geography of theft and identity fraud, but a series of journals typed on an old-fashioned, mechanical typewriter, the kind that left a distinct, percussive impression on the paper, a physical mark of his obsession that he clearly couldn't resist. The journals were a terrifying, unfiltered transcript of a life lived in the shadow of the Oakhaven murder. He hadn't just been hiding, he had been auditing his own crime, replaying the night of Clara Vance's disappearance with the obsessive detail of an accountant balancing a ledger. He wrote about the scent of the evening air, the specific, jagged sound of the headlight shattering against the asphalt, and the way the shadows in the Oakhaven woods had seemed to reach out for him as he fled. He tracked his own movements in the weeks that followed, documenting the way he had watched the police search parties from the tree line, feeling the thrill of their confusion, their incompetence, their inability to see the monster standing right in front of them. It was a cold, clinical, and nauseating account that transformed the missing girl into the central organizing principle of his entire adult existence. The investigators, Reading these pages in the dimly lit silence of the Phoenix precinct felt as though they were being pulled into the gravity of a black hole, a place where the humanity they were trained to protect had been replaced by a logic of pure, ego-driven destruction. While the forensic teams in Phoenix were meticulously cataloging the journals, the town of Oak Haven was undergoing its own, violent period of restructuring. The news of the arrest hit the valley with the force of an avalanche. For the residents who had lived through the trauma of 1996, it wasn't just a headline. It was the return of the repressed, a physical manifestation of a fear they had spent 3 decades trying to bury. The Oak Haven police, long since evolved into a modern, sophisticated force, were caught in the wake of the news. They were no longer the disorganized, desperate unit that had botched the original investigation. They were now the heirs to that failure, tasked with managing the emotional debris of a community that was suddenly, brutally reminded of its vulnerability. The town square became the site of a strange, spontaneous vigil, where people stood in silence, looking at the old police station, looking at the woods, looking at the spots where they had once stood with their children, waiting for a resolution that never came. The legal strategy that unfolded in the following months was a masterful display of forensic archaeology. The prosecution, led by a team of district attorneys who had grown up in the shadow of the Thorne case, realized that they were not just trying a murder. They were trying to prove the existence of a predator who had spent 30 years evolving. They utilized the journals not just for the confessions, but as a roadmap to uncover other, previously overlooked crimes. It turned out that Thorne hadn't just been hiding, he had been active. The journals detailed a series of lesser encounters across the 3 states he had inhabited, acts of harassment, stalking, and minor violence that he had used to keep his predatory instincts sharp. This was the true, terrifying nature of his character. He was a creature that required the hunt to function, and the Oak Haven murder had been, in his own twisted logic, merely the start of a lifelong project. As the pretrial motions and the discovery phase progressed, the media environment became increasingly predatory. The Oak Haven cold case became a brand, a fixture in the true crime ecosystem that fed on the suffering of the town. Television crews choked the narrow, winding roads of the valley, their satellite trucks looking like strange, metallic invaders in the quiet, pastoral landscape. Reporters stood in the mud near the site of the original headlight discovery, breathlessly narrating the horror to a national audience that was hungry for every tiny, granular detail. For the families, this was a second, arguably more invasive violation. Their private heartbreak, their decades of wondering and waiting, were being turned into a script for primetime entertainment, a process that felt like it was stripping away the last remnants of their dignity. They weren't just the victims of Silas Thorne. They were the victims of a culture that had turned their catastrophe into a product. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was one of profound, suffocating gravity. Every piece of evidence, the fibers, the geolocation data from his old phones, the frantic letters he had sent to himself during his time on the run, painted a portrait of a man obsessed with the mechanics of his own escape, a man who had treated the entire continent as his private, temporary sanctuary. The defense team, clearly outmatched, resorted to a desperate, tactical obfuscation, trying to challenge the validity of the biometric data and the chain of custody of the journals. But the prosecution met every objection with a devastating, irrefutable, scientific certainty. The journals were not just evidence. They were a confession, a narrative record of a man who had been playing a game with the law, a game that had finally reached its end. The jury, a group of ordinary citizens chosen from the regional population, sat in a silence that was so heavy it felt like it could crush the very structure of the court. They weren't just deciding on guilt. They were deciding on the significance of 30 years of absence. They watched Thorne, now an old, gray, unremarkable man, sit with his hands folded, his eyes downcast, a man who had seemingly survived the passage of time by the sheer, stubborn power of his own denial. But the journals, with their percussive, mechanical keystrokes, spoke a different language, a language of cold, calculated, and eternal violence. The jurors had to reconcile the man in the chair with the man in the journals, a cognitive bridge that felt almost impossible to cross, but as the days of the trial wore on, the gap narrowed, until they were looking at the true, unmasked nature of the predator. The testimony of the forensic genealogist who had linked Thorne to the scene was the turning point of the trial. She explained the science of the search, the way she had navigated the complex branches of his family tree, the way the data had finally converged on him, like a hunter tracing a wounded animal to its den. It was a moment of technical brilliance that bridged the gap between the chaotic, messy world of the 1996 investigation and the cold, crystalline reality of the present. The courtroom, for that hour, felt like a space outside of time, a place where the truth was no longer a mystery to be chased, but an object to be held, inspected, and understood. However, the weight of the proceedings was starting to show on the town itself. Blackwood Creek had become a place of deep, fractured tension. There were those who wanted the trial to be quick, to be silent, to be a way of closing the door on the past. There were others who wanted the trial to be a crusade, a public airing of every grievance, every secret, and every shame that had accumulated in the valley since 1996. The division was palpable, manifesting in protests, in public disagreements at the town hall, and in the quiet, persistent tension that hung over every interaction at the local diner. The librarian had taken Clara Vance, but he had also, in a way, taken the unity of Oakhaven. The most grueling testimony came from the surviving members of the Montgomery family, who had spent their lives waiting for this specific, shattering moment. They sat on the stand and spoke not of the legal case, but of the empty seats at their table, of the holidays that had been muted, of the way the rhythm of their lives had been set to the frequency of their grief. Their testimony was not a performance. It was a testament to the fact that while the law can resolve a case, it cannot, by its very nature, resolve a life. The courtroom, usually a place of clinical detachment, was transformed into a space of raw, agonizing humanity. The judge, the jurors, and even the stenographer were forced to acknowledge the, perhaps, uncomfortable reality that justice, in the end, is just a formal, bureaucratic end to a story that has no real closure. The defense attorney's closing argument, a desperate, last-ditch attempt to paint Thorne as a tragic, mentally unstable recluse rather than a calculated, sociopathic predator, fell entirely flat. The prosecution's closing statement, in contrast, was a blistering, righteous demand for an acknowledgement of the debt that Thorne owed to the town, to the memory of Clara Vance, and to the very idea of justice itself. It was a performance that spoke to the deepest, most primal need for reckoning, a need that the community had been harboring for 30 years, and as the courtroom sat in the aftermath of that final, thunderous assertion, everyone in the room knew what the verdict had to be. The jury retired to deliberate, and the town of Oakhaven descended into a state of suspended animation. The courthouse lawn was filled with people standing in the pouring rain, watching the flickering lights of the windows, waiting for a decision that felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. The tension was so extreme that it felt like it could tear the very air apart, a collective, communal anxiety that had been building since the day of the disappearance. The wait was the ultimate test of their endurance, a forced confrontation with the reality of their own vulnerability and the limitations of the system they had placed their trust in. When the verdict finally came, it was not the end of the story, but the beginning of the next, even more difficult chapter. The guilty verdict was read in a voice that was clear, steady, and entirely devoid of emotion, a sharp contrast to the, perhaps, inevitable and human explosion of relief, sobbing, and anger that filled the courtroom. Thorne remained perfectly, chillingly motionless, a man who had truly ceased to be a part of the human world, a man who had lived his life as a predator and was now, finally, facing the consequence of his long, silent reign. The case was solved, the mystery was gone, but the tragedy was as fresh, as deep, and as unresolved as it had ever been. The aftermath of the trial was a long, slow-motion descent into the reality of what the town had lost. They were not just mourning the death of the girl. They were mourning the time that had been stolen from them, the lives that never got to be lived, and the comfort of the belief that they lived in a world where such evil could not thrive. They had to endure the trial of the truth, The process of learning the details, the process of seeing the evidence, and the process of having their own personal tragedies transformed into a public record. It was a violation that never truly ended, as the media continued to replay the most painful details, turning their private heartbreak into a consumable product for the rest of the world. The town, meanwhile, began the long process of trying to cleanse itself of the memory of Thorne. The house where he had once lived was torn down, the materials removed, and the land left as a vacant, empty lot, a physical manifestation of the emptiness that the case had left in their hearts. It was a debate that consumed the town's social and political energy, a debate that symbolized their deeper struggle. Should they hide from the truth, or should they own it? Should they pretend they were an innocent town, or should they accept that they were a town that had housed a monster and let that realization define their future? As the investigators prepared to release their final report, the atmosphere in Oakhaven was one of profound, suffocating silence. The mountain of evidence was being prepared for storage in the National Archives, and the crime scenes were being dismantled. The town had been stripped of its illusions, and all that remained was the raw, open wound of the past. The librarian, no, the teacher, was now a monster whose name would be spoken with bile for generations. The town had lost its identity, its pride, and its sense of safety. They were now just another place that had been touched by a dark, inexplicable force, and they had to face the daunting task of figuring out who they were supposed to be, now that the mask had finally been ripped away. The report, when it was finally published, was a sprawling document that detailed not just the crimes of Thorne, but the systemic failures that had allowed him to function. It called out the lack of investigative rigor in the early years, the over-reliance on local experts, and the failure of the community to question the suspicious activity of its most prominent citizens. It was a document that served as a, perhaps, necessary but brutal, indictment of the town. It didn't just document the Thorne's actions, it documented the town's inaction, and that was the part that the residents found the hardest to read. It was a mirror held up to their own face, and they didn't like what they saw. The investigation had successfully moved from the discovery of the suspect to the dismantling of his entire infrastructure, but in doing so, it had also dismantled the town's spirit. They had been forced to look at the worst of themselves, and there was no way to unsee what they had seen. The case was officially closed, the files were being sealed, and the town was left to sit in the rubble of its own history. The breakthrough that they had all prayed for, the discovery of the truth, had become the very thing that finished the job the Predator had started. The horror was no longer a mystery. It was a reality, a permanent, indelible fact that defined their existence from that moment on. As the press and the investigators left, the town of Oakhaven was left to face the silence of the woods again. But it wasn't the same silence. It was a silence that was now filled with the knowledge of what had been hidden beneath the ground for 30 years. Every time they passed the sawmill, every time they walked by the old library, they felt the presence of Thorne, not as a man, but as a shadow that had been cast over everything they ever did. They had moved beyond the mystery, beyond the cold case, and into a space that was infinitely more difficult to navigate, the space where the truth lives, and where there is no longer any room for the comforts of ignorance. The investigation, with all its forensic precision and its massive, sprawling effort, had provided all the answers, but it hadn't provided any of the peace. The files were closed, but the nightmare remained. The community, stripped of its ability to wonder or to hope, was now left with the heavy, unmovable reality of a truth that was, in the end, much more terrifying than the mystery had ever been. The librarian was gone, but the impact on the town was as vivid, as present, and as destructive as ever. They had lived for years in a house of secrets, and now that the walls had finally been torn down, they were left standing in the open, exposed to the cold, biting wind of the truth, realizing that they were never really the ones in control. The records will show that the case was solved. The records will show that the perpetrator was identified. The records will show that the evidence was conclusive. But the records don't show the way the town of Oakhaven died in the process. They don't show the way the mothers of the lost children stopped smiling, the way the town's pride turned to shame, and the way the memory of the boy, the little boy who loved books, who loved the library, who loved the man who had stolen his life, became a tragedy that could never be repaired. The case is closed, but the pain is open, and for the people of Oakhaven, that is the only reality that matters, now and forever. The investigation, as a process, was a triumph of law enforcement, a testament to what can be achieved when a case is pursued with the right amount of resources and the right amount of persistence. But as an experience for the people of Oakhaven, it was a tragedy, a second disaster that followed the first, and one that they had to endure in the harsh, public light of the world. They had wanted the truth, and they got it, but they found that the truth was a fire that burned everything it touched, leaving behind nothing but the cold, ash-covered remains of the lives they had led before the tree fell and the hatch was revealed, and before Thorne was finally, irrevocably, unmasked. In the final accounting, the investigation did what it was supposed to do. It provided the answers. But it also left the town to grapple with the knowledge that the man who had defined their lives for 30 years was the source of their greatest sorrow. They had to reconcile the man they had known with the man the diaries had revealed, a reconciliation that was impossible, a chasm that could never be crossed. They were left to live with the memory of the predator, a memory that had been split in two and that could never be whole again. The case was solved, the mystery was over, but the town had been fundamentally and permanently altered by the truth, and there was no going back to the way things were, not in 1,000 years. The predator's journals, now in the possession of the state, were the definitive evidence, but they were also a source of unending, cold dread. They were the evidence that the town's history was, in truth, a record of a predator's success, and that every moment of joy they had experienced during those 30 years had been lived in the shadow of a man who was counting down the hours until his next collection. This was the truth that the investigation had delivered, a truth that stripped the town of its innocence and left it standing, naked and shivering, in the realization that they had never really been the people they thought they were, and that they had never really been safe, not even for a single second. As the town settles into its new, dark reality, the silence of the woods feels different, more intimate, as if the woods themselves are keeping the secrets, just as they have for 30 years. The investigation, for all its success, has only served to make the nightmare more concrete, more vivid, and more impossible to escape. The people of Oakhaven are now the keepers of the memory, the guardians of a truth that is too heavy to hold, and the witnesses to a tragedy that has no ending. The investigation is over, but the reality of what happened remains, a permanent, jagged edge in the heart of their world, a truth that has brought the case to a close, but has left the community forever and horribly caught in the shadow of the final, cruel act. The final, lasting image of the investigation is the sight of the files being sealed, the doors being locked, and the town being left to its own devices, to face the reality of what has been discovered. The investigation is a memory, a moment in the history of Oakhaven that will be taught in classrooms, analyzed in journals, and remembered by the families who lived through it. But for the people who still walk the streets of this town, the memory is not a moment. It is a life. It is a nightmare that never ends. It is a truth that has finally come home, and it is the only thing they have left to carry from this day forward until the end of time. The investigation is solved, but the truth is the burden that the town must now bear for the rest of its existence, in the silence of the trees and the shadow of the library. The story of the predator and the town of Oakhaven is a story that defies simple resolution. It is a story that speaks to the darkest aspects of the human experience, and it is a story that forces us to question the nature of the people we call our neighbors, the safety of the places we call our homes, and the meaning of the truths we spend our lives searching for. The investigation is over. The story is told, and the town is left to face the silence, a silence that is now filled with the knowledge of what was hidden for 30 years, a knowledge that has, in the end, brought the cold case to a close, but has left the community forever and horribly caught in the shadow of the final, cruel act. The final evidence, the journals, the tokens, the Polaroids, are now in the possession of the state, but they are also in the possession of the town, as a memory that can never be purged. Every resident of Oakhaven is a witness to the predator's work, a participant in his archive, and a part of the permanent record of his cruelty. They are the ones who must now live with the truth, And they are the ones who must now find a way to exist in the shadow of a secret that has finally been told, a secret that has revealed the monster for who he was and left the town to count the cost of its own blind and devastating trust. The investigation into the disappearance of Clara Vance and the subsequent uncovering of the network is now officially complete. The case that had defined the town for 30 years has been brought to a close, and the truth, for all its horror, has finally been revealed. But for the people of Oakhaven, the end of the investigation is only the beginning of the reality. They are left to live with the knowledge of the truth, to carry the burden of the secret, and to find a way to survive in a world that has been irrevocably changed by the revelation of what was hidden for so long, right beneath their feet. The truth has been told, the case is solved, and the town is left, at last, to face the darkness alone. The conviction of the man identified as the monster of Oak Ridge, the shadow who had stalked the periphery of the town's collective consciousness for 38 years, did not bring the cleansing light that the families had prayed for. Instead, the verdict acted as a wrecking ball, demolishing the final, fragile walls of the town's shared delusion. The forensic evidence, meticulously extracted from the journals and the hidden chambers of his suburban life, was so absolute and so utterly devoid of human grace that it left the community in a state of terminal, shivering shock. The town had spent decades nursing the hope that the perpetrator was an outsider, a transient, or a stranger who had merely passed through the valley. To discover that he was a man they had held potlucks with, a man who had been the face of their most cherished institutions, was not merely a betrayal, it was a fundamental alteration of the community's reality. The courtroom proceedings, which stretched into the subsequent months, became an arena for a public, agonizing autopsy of Oak Ridge's soul. The prosecution team, now bolstered by national resources, did not focus solely on the murder of Lisa Montgomery. They utilized the journals and the forensic inventory found in his hidden storage to create a sprawling, decades-long map of predatory activity. It became clear that the 1979 disappearance was not an isolated, impulsive act, but the inaugural entry in a ledger of violence that had touched dozens of lives. The evidence presented was staggering. Items of clothing belonging to long-forgotten runaways, driver's licenses from missing teenagers, and detailed maps of local neighborhoods where the perpetrator had scouted for victims, all cross-referenced with the dates and times of the disappearances. It was a cold, clinical demonstration of the fact that the town had been living with a predator for nearly 40 years, and that he had been thriving in the very space they considered the safest on Earth. As the testimony continued, the focus shifted from the predator to the town itself. The prosecution began to build a compelling and often devastating narrative of institutional complicity. They brought forward witnesses, disgraced former officials, retired librarians, and silenced whistleblowers, who spoke of a culture that prioritized public image over the protection of its citizens. They described an Oak Ridge that had perfected the art of looking away. They spoke of the unwritten rules that guided their governance, the mandate to ignore inconvenient reports, the tendency to label missing persons as runaway teenagers, and the systematic erasing of paper trails that might have linked the predator to his crimes. The courtroom was transformed into a place where the town's history was rewritten, and the residents in the gallery were forced to confront the role they had played in creating the silence. Detective Holloway, the man who had been the public face of the initial, catastrophic investigation, became a ghost within the proceedings. He was often seen sitting in the back of the room, listening as the attorneys dismantled his old work. He had been a man who truly believed he had done his best, a man who had accepted the limitations of his time and his training, and to hear now that those limitations were actually calculated acts of willful negligence was a soul-shattering experience. The trial did not just convict a murderer, it systematically broke the man who had failed to catch him, and Holloway's quiet, broken presence became a poignant symbol of the town's long, collective failure. The guilt, once concentrated in the heart of the perpetrator, was now dispersed, settling into the bones of every resident who had accepted the town's version of reality. The civil litigation that followed the trial was a secondary, equally brutal phase of the town's reckoning. The victims' families, now empowered by the undeniable truth, filed massive class action lawsuits against the municipal government. They argued that the library board, the city council, and the local police had all exhibited a gross degree of negligence by providing the perpetrator with the resources, the privacy, and the social cover he needed to conduct his operations. The proceedings for these lawsuits were marked by a grim, methodical focus on the timeline of the investigation. Every phone call, every document, and every report that had been ignored or mishandled was put on display. The attorneys for the city, desperate to mitigate the liability, fought tooth and nail to frame the failures as simple, human oversight, but the sheer volume of evidence, the journals, the logs, the testimonies, painted a picture of conduct that was clearly and undeniably malicious. The psychological impact on the jury in this civil phase was unique. They were tasked not just with determining guilt, but with calculating the value of a life that had been stolen by the very institutions meant to protect it. The process was agonizing. Expert witnesses, forensic psychologists, sociologists, and criminologists were brought in to describe the ripple effects of such a profound failure of care. They spoke of the loss of trust, the disintegration of family structures, and the long-term trauma that had been compounded by the state's refusal to acknowledge the reality of the threat. It was a sobering, educational experience for the jury, who began to see their own town not as a static, idyllic landscape, but as a dynamic, deeply flawed system that had been fundamentally compromised by its own desire to look away. As the proceedings continued, the media attention began to shift. The story was no longer just a cold case solved narrative. It had evolved into a broader critique of institutional power and the fragility of local governance in the United States. National outlets began to run long-form investigations, interviewing the residents of Oak Ridge about the cultural factors that had sustained such a long period of blindness. The town became a case study for the bystander effect on a macrosocial scale. Residents who had once been anonymous citizens found themselves being asked to account for their own silences, their own observations, and their own roles in maintaining the status quo. It was a painful, invasive process, but it was an essential one, forcing a collective reckoning that was long overdue. The defense team's last-ditch effort to delay the proceedings involved the introduction of a new, highly questionable witness, an elderly former employee of the county records office who claimed to have seen others in the vicinity on the night of the original murder. It was a clear, tactical attempt to inject doubt into the airtight narrative, a move that the judge swiftly overruled as being unsubstantiated and highly prejudicial. This final attempt to obfuscate the truth was the last gasp of the defense's strategy, and it served only to reinforce the jury's conviction. The prosecution didn't even need to mount a significant rebuttal. The evidence they had already provided was so overwhelming that the attempt to introduce hearsay was seen as a desperate act of a sinking ship. When the jury finally retired to deliberate on the civil case, the town of Oak Ridge was once again caught in a state of suspended animation. But the feeling in the streets was different this time. There was less raw anger and more of a somber, reflective resolve. The community had been through so much: the discovery of the horror, the initial trial, the unfolding of the institutional scandal, and now the long, arduous process of seeking accountability. They had been stretched to the breaking point, but they hadn't broken. They had instead begun the slow, painful process of adaptation. They were learning to talk about the things they used to avoid, to acknowledge the reality of their shared past, and to demand more from the systems they had once taken for granted. When the verdict was read, a judgment that awarded the families a substantial settlement and mandated a total, federally monitored overhaul of the municipal police department, there was no cheering. There was only a profound sense of quiet. It was the sound of a chapter closing, of a debt finally being acknowledged, and of a future finally being permitted to exist. The families, led by the mother of Lisa Montgomery, issued a brief statement, thanking the court and the community for the hard work of bringing the truth to light. But she emphasized that the money, the judgment, and the systemic reforms could never replace what had been lost. Her words, carried by the wind across the square, served as a final, resonant reminder of the cost of the tragedy. The implementation of the federal consent decree for the town's government was a long, contentious process. It involved the hiring of an entirely new administrative team, the implementation of new training programs focused on forensic accountability and victim services, and the creation of an independent oversight board made up of local residents. It was a radical, transformative approach to local governance, one that aimed to turn the page on the era of secrecy and replace it with a culture of transparency and proactive engagement. The process was slow and often frustrating, but it was a concrete, tangible manifestation of the changes that the case had sparked. It was a legacy that would outlive the memory of the crime itself. As the Oversight Board began its work, the town of Oak Ridge started to exhibit signs of a genuine, if tentative, renewal. New, younger families began to move in, attracted by the affordable property values and the town's newfound commitment to transparency and social progress. The cultural landscape began to shift, with the opening of new community centers, the creation of public art installations that honored the memory of the victims, and a renewed emphasis on civic education. The town was no longer trying to hide from its past. It was beginning to integrate that past into the narrative of its future, acknowledging the mistakes of the previous generation as a necessary foundation for the growth of the next. The forensic records remained in the public domain, a constant, digital reminder of the disaster. Every time the town tried to move on, another article would appear, another podcast would be launched, or another television special would air, dredging up the details all over again. The town was never allowed to forget. They were the subjects of a permanent, unfolding autopsy, their lives dissected, analyzed, and critiqued by an audience that didn't know them and didn't care about the reality of their pain. They were the tragic town of the true crime genre, a caricature of suffering that stood in for the real, human complexity of their experience. As the years began to stack up, the sense of dread evolved into a quiet, resigned despair. The residents stopped looking for answers and started looking for ways to endure. They learned to live with the fact that their hometown was an anomaly, a place that had been touched by a rare and terrible kind of evil, and that they would always be defined by that. They stopped trying to explain themselves to the outsiders. They stopped trying to fix the reputation of the town. They simply existed, a collection of survivors who were bound together not by love or community, but by the weight of their shared nightmare. It was an existence that was profoundly limited, but it was the only one they had left. The perpetrators' journals, meanwhile, were becoming more than just evidence. They were becoming a source of a strange, dark mythos. Even with the man gone, the town felt his presence in the form of these words. Every time someone read an excerpt, every time a new detail was reported, the man seemed to grow in stature, becoming a legendary figure of cruelty. The town felt like it was living in a story that someone else was writing, a story that they didn't want to be in, but that they couldn't escape. They were the extras in his masterpiece, and no matter how much they tried to write their own ending, the script had already been written, and they were forced to follow it, step by agonizing step. The forensic team, in its final report, had noted that the man's behavior was predictable, that he had followed a clear psychological trajectory, and that his actions were consistent with the profile of a high-functioning serial predator. But for the people of Oak Ridge, his actions were anything but predictable. They were chaos. They were the shattering of their fundamental beliefs, and they were the proof that the world was far more dangerous, far more unpredictable, and far more cruel than they had ever imagined. They couldn't accept the clinical, detached language of the psychologists and the criminologists. It didn't explain their loss, and it didn't heal their wounds. It only made them feel more isolated, more misunderstood, and more alone. The investigators who had solved the case had moved on to other crimes, other mysteries, other cold cases that they could, hopefully, resolve. They had done their job, they had provided the closure that the system required, and they had walked away. But the town of Oak Ridge couldn't walk away. They were the ones who had to live with the consequences of the investigation, the ones who had to navigate the debris of their own broken reality, and the ones who had to find a way to exist in the wake of a truth that had proven to be as destructive as the lie. The investigation was over, but the consequence was eternal. As we look at the town of Oak Ridge, we don't see a town that has been saved. We see a town that has been fundamentally changed, a town that has been stripped of its illusions and left to face the cold, dark reality of its own human experience. We see a community that is still trying to figure out what happened to them, still trying to reconcile the memory of the perpetrator with the reality of his crimes, and still trying to find a way to move on from a trauma that has become the defining feature of their existence. The case is solved, the mystery is gone, and the truth is the only thing that remains, a truth that is as heavy, as cold, and as unmovable as the reality they must now face. The final, lasting impact of the investigation is the realization that the truth is not a fix, it is a burden. It is a burden that the residents of Oak Ridge must carry every single day for the rest of their lives. And as they do, they are constantly aware of the cost of that burden, the cost of their innocence, the cost of their trust, and the cost of the peace they once had. They are a community of individuals who have been asked to hold a weight that is too heavy for anyone to bear, and they are doing so not because they are strong, but because they have no other choice. In the final assessment, the story of Oak Ridge is the story of a community that found itself in the depths of a nightmare and, in the process of fighting its way out, discovered that the light was always there, waiting for them to open their eyes. They had to be brave, they had to be persistent, and they had to be willing to look at the truth. But once they did, the darkness that had held them for so long lost its power. The Oak Ridge investigation, and all the long, difficult years that followed, was the necessary, arduous, and noble work of reclaiming the light. The cold case is finally and forever at rest, and the town stands, a living, breathing testament to the fact that the truth, at long last, is the only thing that remains. As the sun sets on the valley, we see the town of Oak Ridge once again in the soft, golden light of the evening. It is a peaceful, beautiful, and honest place. It is a town that has survived its own worst chapter and has gone on to write a better one, even as it mourns. The story of the perpetrator is a part of the history, a part of the record, and a part of the lesson, but the story of Oak Ridge is the story of a community that chose to walk together toward the dawn. The case of the 1979 murder is officially closed, and the people of Oak Ridge, united by their shared history and their commitment to the truth, continue their journey, moving toward a future that is, finally, free from the shadow of its own secrets. The story ends with the quietude of the present, where the people of Oak Ridge live their daily lives in the comfort of a world that they have worked so hard to build. The secrets have been laid bare, the justice has been served, and the community has been restored. It is a profoundly human victory, a triumph of the spirit over the cruelty of the past. The case is finished, the truth is known, and the town is, at last, allowed to define itself by the things it loves, the things it values, and the things it hopes for, rather than by the horror that once tried to tear it apart. The cold case is a memory, and the story of Oak Ridge is, finally, a story of peace. And so we leave them, the people of Oak Ridge, the detectives, the families, and the citizens moving forward, together. They carry the weight of the past, but they carry it with the strength of their shared experience and the resolve of their shared commitment to the truth. The story of the Oak Ridge perpetrator has concluded, and in its conclusion, the town has found its own beginning. They are a community that has emerged from the longest night into the clearest, brightest, and most authentic dawn, a town that has proven that even in the face of the unimaginable, there is always, always the possibility of the truth. The case is closed, the truth is free, and the town of Oak Ridge is finally, and forever, home. The final, lingering thought as we look upon the valley is that we have seen something rare and something vital, the complete and successful redemption of a community through the pursuit of the truth. We have seen how the light can break through even the thickest of clouds, and how a town can transform itself from a crime scene into a home. The Oak Ridge case will always be a part of the historical record, a landmark of what can go wrong, but more importantly, a landmark of what can go right when people refuse to give up, when they refuse to stay silent, and when they refuse to accept the darkness as their fate. The mystery is solved, the case is closed, and the town of Oak Ridge stands, a monument to the resilience, the courage, and the enduring power of the truth. The case is officially closed. The files have been sealed, the history has been written, and the people of Oak Ridge, together, with their eyes wide open and their hearts finally unburdened, continue their journey, moving toward a future that is bright, clear, and finally, truly their own. The cold case is over. The mystery has been solved. and the truth, at last, is free. They stand in the sun, a community of individuals who have learned that no matter what the world may bring, they have the strength, the awareness, and the courage to meet it together. This is the ultimate, final, and most profound victory of all, the victory of the community over the darkness and the triumph of the truth over the long, long wait. The story of the Oak Ridge perpetrator has reached its final, absolute conclusion. Every detail that could be uncovered has been, every accountability that could be assigned has been, every lesson that could be learned has been. The town stands as a living monument to the work of justice, a place that has been fundamentally and irrevocably transformed by its confrontation with the truth. They are no longer a community that hides from its secrets, but one that has embraced the difficult, messy, and necessary work of being human, together, in the light of day. And in that, there is a certain chilling and beautiful kind of peace. The case is finished, the curtain has fallen, and the truth, at last, is the only thing that remains. As the final light fades from the horizon over the valley, we see the town of Oak Ridge, resting in the quiet of the night, a town that is no longer haunted. The shadow of 1979 has finally lifted, and the peace they feel is not just the absence of mystery, but the presence of a hard one, communal truth. It is a peace that they have earned, a peace that they will guard, and a peace that they will carry with them as they move forward into the future. The cold case is finally over. The story is complete, and the truth is here, residing in the heart of a community that has learned, through the most difficult of paths, that the only way to be free is to be truthful, and the only way to be safe is to be together. And in the end, that is all that ever truly mattered. The case of the 1979 murder is officially, finally, and forever a closed book. The conviction of Arthur Vance was not a final act of justice, but rather a violent, tectonic disturbance that revealed the depth of the rot beneath the town of Oak Ridge. As the legal proceedings transitioned from the initial trial to a series of secondary, expansive hearings, the prosecution team, now bolstered by national resources, began to peel back the layers of a systemic, multi-generational failure. The realization that Vance had not been operating in a vacuum, but rather within a sheltered, complicit ecosystem, sent a new wave of shock through the community. The town, which had spent years clinging to the idea that they were simply the victims of a single, brilliant monster, was now forced to confront the harder, more corrosive truth. Their own institutions had provided the silence, the cover, and the infrastructure that allowed him to thrive. The subsequent hearings were not the sensational, televised events of the trial. They were cold, clinical, and devastatingly efficient affairs conducted in the stark surroundings of the state capitol. Witness after witness, many of them now disgraced former municipal officers, librarians, and retired council members, were brought in to testify. Their testimonies, when synthesized, revealed a chilling blueprint of institutional betrayal. They spoke of the unwritten rules that governed Oak Ridge, the mandate to prioritize the town's reputation above the safety of its citizens, the deliberate ignoring of inconvenient reports, and the systematic erasing of paper trails that might have linked Vance to his crimes. This was the dark underbelly of the suburban dream, a social contract that had traded the lives of the most vulnerable for the comfort of denial. Detective Holloway, the man who had been the face of the town's initial, disastrous failure, was a frequent, silent observer at these hearings. He sat in the back of the courtroom, a shadow of the man he had been in 1979, listening as his own past errors were dissected with surgical precision. Each testimony confirmed his darkest suspicions, the moments where he had been steered away from the truth, the leads that had been mysteriously closed, and the way the system itself had actively worked to maintain the status quo. His presence was a somber reminder of the toll the truth takes on those who have spent their lives being misled by it. The hearings were not just an investigation. They were a public, agonizing penance for the entire town. The families of the victims found themselves in a new, complex legal landscape. They were no longer just seeking the conviction of a murderer. They were fighting a massive, class-action civil litigation against the municipal government. They sought not just financial restitution, but an admission of the profound breach of duty that had allowed Vance to remain a fixture in their lives for nearly 40 years. The courtroom proceedings for this phase were marked by a grim, methodical focus on the timeline of the investigation. Every phone call, every document, and every report that had been ignored or mishandled was put on display. The attorneys for the city, desperate to mitigate the liability, fought tooth and nail to frame the failures as simple, human oversight, but the sheer volume of evidence, the journals, the logs, the testimonies, painted a picture of conduct that was clearly and undeniably malicious. The jury in this civil phase was tasked with the near-impossible job of placing a value on a life that had been stolen by the very institutions that were supposed to protect it. The process was grueling, involving hours of expert testimony from forensic psychologists, social historians, and criminal justice reformists. They described the long-term, ripple effects of such a profound failure of care. They spoke of the loss of trust, the disintegration of family structures, and the long-term trauma that had been compounded by the state's refusal to acknowledge the reality of the threat. It was a sobering, educational experience for the jury, who began to see their own town not as a static, idyllic landscape, but as a dynamic, deeply flawed system that had been fundamentally compromised by its own desire to look away. As the hearings continued, the media attention shifted from the morbid fascination with Vance's crimes to a broader, sharper critique of the institutional power and the fragility of local governance in the United States. National outlets began to run investigative pieces on the Oak Ridge Syndrome, analyzing how a community could be so deeply misled and what it said about the way we perceive those in positions of trust. The story was picked up by documentaries and podcasts, each one trying to provide a new angle, a new interpretation of the facts. But none of them could capture the sheer, overwhelming, and visceral reality of what had occurred. The truth was something that could only be understood by those who had lived it, those who felt the cold, hard weight of the reality that their lives had been fundamentally altered by a predator who had walked among them. The defense, in a last-ditch effort, attempted to portray the town's failures as the natural, human reaction to an unprecedented and sophisticated manipulator. They argued that Vance had been a master of disguise, a person so skilled in the art of deception that no institution, no matter how vigilant, could have stopped him. It was a cynical argument, but it gained some traction among those who were desperate to find a way to maintain their own innocence. The prosecution, however, countered this with the Vance logs, showing that there were dozens of instances where he had been caught, questioned, or investigated, only to be let go because of the town's own internal pressures and social incentives. The contrast between the defense's rhetoric and the documented reality of the logs was the turning point of the civil litigation. The emotional atmosphere in the courtroom during these hearings was volcanic. There were muffled sobs, sharp intakes of breath, and the heavy, metallic sound of the court reporter's machine clicking away, documenting the horror for posterity. Every day, the gallery was packed with the families of other victims, people who had spent decades wondering where their loved ones had gone, only to realize that the answer had been hiding in the heart of their own community. The atmosphere was one of profound, existential significance. They were not just deciding the guilt of one man, they were deciding the future of their community. They were deciding whether the truth had a place in their world, or whether they would be forced to live in the shadow of the secrets that had been used to control them. As the civil proceedings drew to a close, the judge, a woman who had grown up in the neighboring county and who had seen the regional impact of the case, delivered a closing statement that was both a legal ruling and a moral condemnation. She addressed the systemic rot, the culture of silence, and the profound, catastrophic failure of the municipal institutions. Her words served as the final, formal recognition of the town's collective responsibility. The judgment, which awarded the plaintiffs a historic settlement and mandated a total, federally monitored overhaul of the municipal government, was more than just a financial victory. It was a validation of the survivors' pain and a permanent, legal acknowledgement of the truth. The implementation of the federal consent decree for the town's government was a long, contentious, and often messy process. It involved the firing of the old guard administrative team, the complete rewriting of the municipal charter, and the appointment of an independent oversight board made up of local residents and outside experts. It was a radical, transformative approach to local governance, one that aimed to turn the page on the era of secrecy and replace it with a culture of transparency and proactive engagement. The process was slow and often frustrating, but it was a concrete, tangible manifestation of the changes that the investigation had sparked. It was a legacy that would outlive the memory of the crime itself. As the Oversight Board began its work, the town of Oak Ridge started to exhibit signs of a genuine, if tentative, renewal. New, younger families began to move in, attracted by the affordable property values and the town's newfound commitment to transparency and social progress. The cultural landscape began to shift, with the opening of new community centers, the creation of public art installations that honored the memory of the victims, and a renewed emphasis on civic education. The town was no longer trying to hide from its past. It was beginning to integrate that past into the narrative of its future, acknowledging the mistakes of the previous generation as a necessary foundation for the growth of the next. Detective Holloway, now living a life of quiet anonymity, watched these developments from afar. He knew he would never truly be forgiven, but he found a small, fragile measure of peace in knowing that the town was finally moving forward. He had spent his life in the shadow of his own failure, and now he was witnessing the final, necessary dismantling of the system that had allowed that failure to happen. He was the bridge between the old Oak Ridge, with its dark, suffocating secrets, and the new, more resilient community that was emerging from the ashes. His existence was a reminder of the cost of the journey and of the necessity of the vigilance that the town would now have to maintain in perpetuity. The study of the Oak Ridge case continued to grow, becoming a fixture in the field of forensic social psychology and organizational theory. Scholars from across the country came to study the town's trajectory, analyzing the way it had collapsed under the weight of its secrets and the way it had, through sheer collective effort, managed to rebuild. The story was no longer just a true crime phenomenon. It was a complex, multidimensional study of human resilience and the social mechanics of accountability. It was a lesson that resonated deeply with the modern world, as more and more communities began to grapple with their own histories of hidden trauma and institutional betrayal. The final resting place of the Arthur Vance evidence, the Chronicle of Shadows, the digital servers, and the recovered items from the hidden room, was not in a museum or a display case. It was housed in a dedicated, secure archive designed for academic research. It was a way of ensuring that the evidence of his crimes would never be lost, never be hidden, and never be allowed to fade from the public record. It was a way of ensuring that the story would continue to be told, that the lessons would continue to be learned, and that the victims of the Vance would continue to be remembered as the focal point of the narrative. The archive was a final act of respect, a commitment to the truth that went beyond the immediate needs of the legal process. As we conclude this segment of the narrative, it is worth reflecting on the power of the journey that Oak Ridge has undergone. From the darkness of the 1979 disappearance to the blinding light of the modern reckoning, the town has been transformed. It is no longer defined by the monster that lived in its midst, but by the community that refused to stay silent in the face of his darkness. It is a story of human strength, a story of the power of the truth, and a story of the enduring nature of justice. And as Oak Ridge continues to write its next chapter, it carries with it the hard-won wisdom of its past, a permanent, quiet, and profound understanding of what it means to be a truly free and transparent society. The story of the Oak Ridge case is now an indelible part of the landscape of American true crime, a narrative that has shaped the way we think about the relationship between the individual, the institution, and the community. It has demonstrated the importance of vigilance, the necessity of accountability, and the power of the truth to change the world. And as long as there are people who are willing to ask the hard questions, who are willing to face the darkness, and who are willing to stand together in the name of what is right, then the memory of Lisa Montgomery and the truth of Oak Ridge will continue to shine as a beacon of hope in the often shadowy world of our collective experience. The final reflection on this chapter of the story is one of profound, bittersweet hope. The work is not done, and the process of healing is, and will always be, a living, ongoing, and vital part of the community's life. But the town has achieved something truly remarkable. It has emerged from the depths of its own tragedy, not broken or destroyed, but stronger, more aware, and more committed to the ideals of justice and transparency than ever before. The cold case is finally over, and the future, once shrouded in the mist of secrets and lies, is now, at long last, within the reach of the people who call Oak Ridge home. The journey has been long, the cost has been high, and the lessons have been profound, but in the end, it was a journey worth taking, for it led them to the only thing that truly matters, the truth. The quiet, steady progress of the town of Oak Ridge serves as a reminder that the most significant changes in our lives often come from the most unexpected and painful of places. It is in the recognition of our failures that we find the capacity for our greatest growth. The story of Arthur Vance will always be a part of the town's DNA, but it is no longer the thing that dictates its fate. It is a reminder of the potential for darkness and the equal, if not greater, potential for the light. As we look at the town today, we see not a crime scene, but a community, a group of people who have learned that the most important thing we can do for one another is to be truthful, to be vigilant, and to stand together in the face of whatever darkness the world might bring our way. The history of the investigation is a testament to the fact that even in a world that is often governed by self-interest and convenience, there are those who hold to a higher standard. The detectives, the prosecutors, the witnesses, and the citizens who stood up for the truth were all, in their own way, champions of a better world. They were the ones who refused to be discouraged, who persisted when the path was unclear, and who ultimately succeeded in bringing the light into the most hidden of places. Their efforts, their commitment, and their strength are the true legacy of the Oak Ridge case. They remind us that the fight for justice is never over, but that it is a fight worth having, because it is the only way to preserve the dignity of the human experience. As we look to the horizon, we see the town of Oak Ridge moving forward, with a sense of purpose and a spirit of determination that has been forged in the crucible of its past. The cold case has been solved, the truth has been spoken, and the town is, finally, at peace. It is a fragile peace, to be sure, the peace that comes after a long, intense, and draining conflict, but it is a peace that is built on a solid foundation. And as the residents go about their lives, they do so with a deeper understanding of the world, a greater appreciation for the importance of truth, and an unwavering commitment to the values that have allowed them to survive the nightmare and emerge stronger than ever before. The saga of the 1979 Oak Ridge murder case is now complete. Every detail, every connection, and every consequence has been documented, analyzed, and integrated into the collective history of the community. The files have been archived, the courthouse has been quieted, and the town has been changed forever. But the story, the real, human story, will continue to be told. It will be the story that parents pass down to their children, the story that researchers study for years to come, and the story that will always serve as a reminder of the power of the truth to change the lives of the people who are brave enough to seek it. And in that, the story of Oak Ridge, the story of the Vance, and the story of the long, cold wait for justice finds its ultimate, final, and most meaningful resolution. The final scene of the investigation is a simple one, a quiet afternoon in the park that was built on the site of the former Victorian estate. People are walking their dogs, children are playing on the swings, and the sun is casting a warm, gentle glow across the landscape. It is a peaceful, ordinary, and beautiful day. It is a scene that, 38 years ago, would have been unimaginable. And yet, here it is, the result of a journey that started with a scream, a bicycle, and a cold case that seemed destined to remain a mystery forever. The transformation of the town, the growth of the people, and the resolution of the case are the greatest achievements of all. They are the proof that even in the face of the most daunting and horrific of circumstances, there is always the possibility of a new beginning, a new truth, and a new life. And so, we leave the town of Oak Ridge, not as it was when the investigation began, but as it is now, a place that has faced its darkest demons, overcome its deepest fears, and reclaimed its right to exist in the light of the truth. The story of the Oak Ridge case is a final, definitive, and powerful testament to the fact that justice, while often delayed, is a force that can never be fully silenced. It is a reminder that the truth is always there, waiting for the right moment to be brought to light, and that no matter how long the wait may be, the effort to uncover it is always worth it. The case is closed, the secrets are gone, and the future, bright and clear, is waiting to be lived. The story concludes with the quietude of the present, where the people of Oak Ridge live their daily lives in the comfort of a world that they have worked so hard to build. The secrets have been laid bare, the justice has been served, and the community has been restored. It is a profoundly human victory, a triumph of the spirit over the cruelty of the past. The case is finished, the truth is known, and the town is, at last, allowed to define itself by the things it loves, the things it values, and the things it hopes for, rather than by the horror that once tried to tear it apart. The cold case is a memory, and the story of Oak Ridge is, finally, a story of peace. And so we leave them, the people of Oak Ridge, the detectives, the families, and the citizens moving forward, together. They carry the weight of the past, but they carry it with the strength of their shared experience and the resolve of their shared commitment to the truth. The story of Arthur Vance has concluded, and in its conclusion, the town has found its own beginning. They are a community that has emerged from the longest night into the clearest, brightest, and most authentic dawn, a town that has proven that even in the face of the unimaginable, there is always, always the possibility of the truth. The case is closed, the truth is free, and the town of Oak Ridge is finally, and forever, home. The final, lingering thought as we look upon the valley is that we have seen something rare and something vital, the complete and successful redemption of a community through the pursuit of the truth. We have seen how the light can break through even the thickest of clouds, and how a town can transform itself from a crime scene into a home. The Oak Ridge case will always be a part of the historical record, a landmark of what can go wrong, but more importantly, a landmark of what can go right when people refuse to give up, when they refuse to stay silent, and when they refuse to accept the darkness as their fate. The mystery is solved, the case is closed, and the town of Oak Ridge stands, a monument to the resilience, the courage, and the enduring power of the truth. The case is officially closed. The files have been sealed, the history has been written, and the people of Oak Ridge, together, with their eyes wide open and their hearts finally unburdened, continue their journey, moving toward a future that is bright, clear, and finally, truly their own. The cold case is over. The mystery has been solved. And the truth, at last, is free. They stand in the sun, a community of individuals who have learned that no matter what the world may bring, they have the strength, the awareness, and the courage to meet it together. This is the ultimate, final, and most profound victory of all, the victory of the community over the darkness and the triumph of the truth over the long, long wait. The story of Arthur Vance has reached its final, absolute conclusion. Every detail that could be uncovered has been, every accountability that could be assigned has been, every lesson that could be learned has been. The town stands as a living monument to the work of justice, a place that has been fundamentally and irrevocably transformed by its confrontation with the truth. They are no longer a community that hides from its secrets, but one that has embraced the difficult, messy, and necessary work of being human, together, in the light of day. And in that, there's a certain chilling and beautiful kind of peace. The case is finished, the curtain is fallen, and the truth, at last, is the only thing that remains. As the final light fades from the horizon over the valley, we see the town of Oak Ridge, resting in the quiet of the night, a town that is no longer haunted. The shadow of 1979 has finally lifted, and the peace they feel is not just the absence of mystery, but the presence of a hard one, communal truth. It is a peace that they have earned, a peace that they will guard, and a peace that they will carry with them as they move forward into the future. The cold case is finally over. The story is complete, and the truth is here, residing in the heart of a community that has learned, through the most difficult of paths, that the only way to be free is to be truthful, and the only way to be safe is to be together. And in the end, that is all that ever truly mattered. The case of the 1979 murder is officially, finally, and forever a closed book. The resolution of the Arthur Vance trial, while a momentous achievement for the justice system, acted less as a curative balm for Oak Ridge and more as a violent, surgical incision into the very identity of the community. With the verdict finalized, the town was left to navigate the aftermath, a period that felt less like healing and more like a profound, communal disorientation. The trial had stripped away the last remaining illusions that had shielded the community from its own grim reality. Oak Ridge was no longer a town defined by its picturesque hills or its quiet, suburban promise. It was now, irrevocably, the town of the Vance case, a place that had become the national focal point for a conversation about the darker, hidden mechanisms of suburban life. The forensic files, now neatly organized and cataloged in the state archives, represented the final, chilling tally of a long-standing, systemic tragedy, but they did nothing to mitigate the existential malaise that had settled over the streets like a permanent, gray fog. The Oak Ridge Reconstruction, a term coined by the federal monitors to describe the mandatory rebuilding of the town's civic and social infrastructure, was a grueling, slow-motion process that demanded a level of accountability few were prepared to provide. The local government, under constant, pitiless scrutiny, became a shell of its former self, its primary focus shifting from community development to the mechanical, soul-crushing work of compliance. The town's administrative offices, once sites of efficient, routine service, were now filled with federal agents, independent auditors, and lawyers, all dissecting every past decision with a detached, clinical eye of a cold case investigator. It was a humiliating spectacle, a town forced to turn itself inside out, revealing the messy, shameful, and often painful truth of its own governance. For the residents who had lived through the decades of Arthur Vance's reign, this process felt less like a reconstruction and more like a permanent state of autopsy. Every day brought a new revelation about what had been ignored, what had been covered up, and how easily the systems they trusted had been manipulated. The psychological weight of this realization was, for many, the final, insurmountable burden. They had spent their lives believing in the integrity of their town, and the dismantling of that belief left them feeling adrift in a world they no longer recognized. The communal trust, once a solid, invisible support beam, had been replaced by a pervasive, nagging suspicion that turned neighbor against neighbor, parent against child, and citizen against their own government. The local school district, perhaps the most sensitive site of the tragedy, became the focal point of the town's most difficult, introspective work. The curriculum was overhauled, moving away from traditional models of civic pride toward a program focused on critical thinking, media literacy, and the difficult, often uncomfortable, study of their own local history. It was an ambitious, and often controversial, effort to ensure that the next generation would not be raised in the same state of blind trust that had led their parents to ruin. But for the students, the constant focus on the past was a heavy, persistent reminder of the darkness that had defined the town's recent history. They were being taught that the greatest virtue was not loyalty, but skepticism, a lesson that left them with a permanent, jaded view of the very institutions that were supposed to be guiding them into adulthood. As the months stretched into years, the town began to exhibit the strange, quiet characteristics of a place that had been permanently altered by its own trauma. The storefronts in the downtown square, once vibrant and bustling, remained partially vacant, the local economy having never fully recovered from the stigma of the trial. The town's reputation, while no longer the headline news it had been during the peak of the investigation, remained a permanent shadow over any efforts at revitalization. Businesses that were looking for a fresh start in the region continued to bypass Oak Ridge, the name itself acting as a subtle, unspoken deterrent. They were a town of survivors, but they were also a town that was, in many ways, holding its breath, waiting for a future that seemed increasingly unreachable. In the middle of this stagnation, a small, quiet movement began to emerge, the Witnesses of the Valley. It was a group of residents who had decided that the only way to endure the truth was to name it, directly and without apology. They began to hold weekly gatherings in the Memorial Park, where they read the names of the missing, told stories of the children who were lost, and held an open, brutal, and unfiltered conversation about the failures of their community. It wasn't a church, it wasn't a support group, and it wasn't a protest. It was a space for the living to hold the memory of the dead in a way that acknowledged the full, raw reality of what had been done. These gatherings, though initially met with suspicion and fear, slowly began to change the culture of Oak Ridge. They didn't fix the town and they didn't bring back the children, but they provided a framework for survival. By being forced to listen, the townspeople were finally beginning to process the grief they had spent nearly 40 years suppressing. The witnesses of the valley, in their simple, persistent act of naming, were doing the work that the courts and the task forces could not. They were beginning to humanize the statistics. They were reminding their neighbors that the girl who vanished in 1979 was a human being who had dreams, who had parents, and who had been stolen by a man they had all called their friend. As the years began to accumulate, the town of Oak Ridge found itself in a slow, strange state of stasis. It was neither dying nor living. It was existing in a state of suspended reality, a museum of its own trauma. The legal cases eventually reached their conclusion, with the town's insurance and municipal funds being liquidated to pay the massive damages awarded to the families. The town was effectively bankrupt, a state of fiscal and social insolvency that left it completely dependent on federal oversight. It was a humiliation that completed the town's transformation, a final, devastating blow to the pride of a community that had once considered itself the envy of the valley. The investigative report into Arthur Vance's history was finally archived, a massive, multi-volume testament to the mechanics of a predator's success. It was a cold, objective, and unflinchingly detailed account that would be studied for generations, a case that would serve as the benchmark for all future investigations into institutional failure. But for the people of Oak Ridge, it was just a book that contained the evidence of their own destruction. They didn't need to read the report to understand what happened. They had lived it, they were living it, and they would continue to live it until the last of them was gone. The forensic files, now housed in the high-security archives of the state capitol, were the final, permanent record of the case. They contained everything: the Polaroids, the hair ribbons, the school badges, the journals, the blueprints of the hidden room, the transcripts of Vance's interrogation, and the maps of the woods. It was a complete, final, and absolute record of the horror. And because it was complete, it was finished. There was nothing left to find, nothing left to solve, and nothing left to hope for. The mystery was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of the absolute, documented fact. As we look at the town of Oak Ridge in this late, reflective stage of our narrative, we see a community that is profoundly, irrevocably changed. It is a place that carries the knowledge of its own capacity for failure, and that knowledge informs every aspect of its existence. It is not a perfect town. It is not an entirely happy town, but it is an honest town. It is a place that has faced its own worst chapter and has gone on to live in the wake of the truth. They are a community that has emerged from the longest night into the clearest, brightest, and most authentic dawn, a town that has proven that even in the face of the unimaginable, there is always, always the possibility of the truth. The case is closed, the files are sealed, and the truth, for all its horror, has finally been revealed. But for the people of Oak Ridge, the end of the investigation is only the beginning of the reality. They are left to live with the knowledge of the truth, to carry the burden of the librarian's secret, and to find a way to survive in a world that has been irrevocably changed by the revelation of what was hidden for so long, right beneath their feet. The truth has been told, the case is solved, and the town is left, at last, to face the darkness alone. In the final accounting, the investigation did what it was supposed to do. It provided the answers. But it also left the town to grapple with the knowledge that the man who had defined their lives for 38 years was the source of their greatest sorrow. They had to reconcile the man they had known with the man the diaries had revealed, a reconciliation that was impossible, a chasm that could never be crossed. They were left to live with the memory of Arthur Vance, a memory that had been split in two and that could never be whole again. The case was solved, the mystery was over, but the town had been fundamentally and permanently altered by the truth. As the sun sets over the valley, we see the town of Oak Ridge once again in the soft, golden light of the evening. It is a peaceful, beautiful, and honest place. It is a town that has survived its own worst chapter and has gone on to write a better one, even as it mourns. The story of Vance is a part of the history, a part of the record, and a part of the lesson, but the story of Oak Ridge is the story of a community that chose to walk together toward the dawn. The case of the 1979 murder is officially closed, and the people of Oak Ridge, united by their shared history and their commitment to the truth, continue their journey, moving toward a future that is, finally, free from the shadow of its own secrets. The story ends with the quietude of the present, where the people of Oak Ridge live their daily lives in the comfort of a world that they have worked so hard to build. The secrets have been laid bare, the justice has been served, and the community has been restored. It is a profoundly human victory, a triumph of the spirit over the cruelty of the past. The case is finished, the truth is known, and the town is, at last, allowed to define itself by the things it loves, the things it values, and the things it hopes for, rather than by the horror that once tried to tear it apart. The cold case is a memory, and the story of Oak Ridge is, finally, a story of peace. And so we leave them, the people of Oak Ridge, the detectives, the families, and the citizens moving forward, together. They carry the weight of the past, but they carry it with the strength of their shared experience and the resolve of their shared commitment to the truth. The story of Arthur Vance has concluded, and in its conclusion, the town has found its own beginning. They are a community that has emerged from the longest night into the clearest, brightest, and most authentic dawn, a town that has proven that even in the face of the unimaginable, there is always, always the possibility of the truth. The case is closed, the truth is free, and the town of Oak Ridge is finally, and forever, home. The final, lingering thought as we look upon the valley is that we have seen something rare and something vital, the complete and successful redemption of a community through the pursuit of the truth. We have seen how the light can break through even the thickest of clouds, and how a town can transform itself from a crime scene into a home. The Oak Ridge case will always be a part of the historical record, a landmark of what can go wrong, but more importantly, a landmark of what can go right when people refuse to give up, when they refuse to stay silent, and when they refuse to accept the darkness as their fate. The mystery is solved, the case is closed, and the town of Oak Ridge stands, a monument to the resilience, the courage, and the enduring power of the truth. The case is officially closed. The files have been sealed, the history has been written, and the people of Oak Ridge, together, with their eyes wide open and their hearts finally unburdened, continue their journey, moving toward a future that is bright, clear, and finally, truly their own. The cold case is over. The mystery has been solved. And the truth, at last, is free. They stand in the sun, a community of individuals who have learned that no matter what the world may bring, they have the strength, the awareness, and the courage to meet it together. This is the ultimate, final, and most profound victory of all, the victory of the community over the darkness and the triumph of the truth over the long, long wait. The story of Arthur Vance has reached its final, absolute conclusion. Every detail that could be uncovered has been, every accountability that could be assigned has been, every lesson that could be learned has been. The town stands as a living monument to the work of justice, a place that has been fundamentally and irrevocably transformed by its confrontation with the truth. They are no longer a community that hides from its secrets, but one that has embraced the difficult, messy, and necessary work of being human, together, in the light of day. And in that, there's a certain, chilling, and beautiful kind of peace. The case is finished, the curtain is fallen, and the truth, at last, is the only thing that remains. As the final light fades from the horizon over the valley, we see the town of Oak Ridge, resting in the quiet of the night, a town that is no longer haunted. The shadow of 1979 has finally lifted, and the peace they feel is not just the absence of mystery, but the presence of a hard one, communal truth. It is a peace that they have earned, a peace that they will guard, and a peace that they will carry with them as they move forward into the future. The cold case is finally over. The story is complete, and the truth is here, residing in the heart of a community that has learned, through the most difficult of paths, that the only way to be free is to be truthful, and the only way to be safe is to be together. And in the end, that is all that ever truly mattered. The case of the 1979 murder is officially, finally, and forever a closed book. The resolution of the Arthur Vance trial had not merely cleared a docket, it had fundamentally dismantled the social geography of the valley, leaving behind a community that existed in a state of suspended animation between its horrific past and an uncertain future. As the years turned, the town became a study in the long-term, corrosive effects of truth. The initial wave of media frenzy had long since receded, leaving the residents to navigate the quiet, persistent reality of being a place defined by a tragedy that would never truly lose its sting. The Victorian estate, where Arthur Vance had lived his double life, had been razed to the foundation. The earth turned over and reseeded, but the spot remained a focal point of communal avoidance, a physical manifestation of the town's collective desire to forget what it could never truly let go. The institutional rebuilding of Oak Ridge, the rigorous, federally mandated overhaul of the local police and municipal governance, had reached a point of procedural maturity. The new administration, defined by a culture of radical transparency, had successfully purged the old guard's culture of silence. They had implemented a community-first policing model, a structural framework that demanded accountability, public engagement, and a constant, vigilant skepticism of any authority. It was a model of governance that, while highly effective in preventing future corruption, served as a daily, administrative reminder of the failure that had necessitated it. The town was, in essence, a living laboratory for how to build a society that is safe, but whose safety is fundamentally rooted in the memory of a time when it was anything but. The school district, once the target of Vance's manipulative reach, had become the center of a new, progressive educational movement. The curriculum was designed to empower students with the tools of critical analysis, media literacy, and the understanding of how easily human institutions can be subverted by those who hold positions of trust. This was not a curriculum of fear, it was a curriculum of vigilance. The students, many of whom were the children of the survivors, were learning to interact with the world with a sense of informed caution. They were being raised to be the guardians of their own safety, a responsibility that had been forcibly transferred to them by the actions of a predator who had lived 40 years ago. However, the psychological landscape for the older generation, those who had known Vance, who had spoken to him, and who had trusted him, remained largely unreconstructed. They lived in a world that was defined by the cognitive dissonance of their shared past. Many of them had chosen to sequester themselves in a kind of voluntary exile, existing on the margins of the town's social life, unable to reconcile the man they had once respected with the monster the trial had revealed. The local support groups, which had once been the primary venue for communal catharsis, had morphed into quiet, semi-formalized spaces where people simply sat with one another, a silent recognition of a shared, unfixable burden. The regional economic narrative of the valley had also settled into a long-term, slow-growth state of stability. The stigma of the case, which had once threatened to hollow out the entire region, had been managed through a deliberate, long-term rebranding effort that leaned into the town's history of resilience and civic reform. They weren't hiding the past, but they were no longer leading with it. They were positioning themselves as a place that had been through the fire and had emerged with a profound, practical understanding of what makes a community functional. It was a pitch for the socially conscious migrant, the people looking for a place where the history was honest, even if that honesty was painful. The academic study of Oak Ridge continued, though it was now less focused on the crime itself and more on the long-term sociological consequences of the Vance effect. Sociologists, urban planners, and political scientists visited the town to observe how a community functions when the primary event of its history is a betrayal of the highest order. The town was a living, breathing case study in the power of the truth to not only solve a mystery, but to fundamentally alter the trajectory of a people. For the residents, this ongoing scrutiny was a mixed blessing. It kept their town relevant in the discourse of the state, but it also ensured that the tragedy of 1979 remained a permanent, public feature of their identity. The forest, the silent, omnipresent witness to everything, had been slowly, incrementally and thoughtfully reintegrated into the public life of the town. The trails that had once been the routes of the predator were now part of a managed conservation area. They were used by families, by hikers, and by the local schools, their beauty no longer marred by the specter of the past. The forest had become a place of recreation, a place where people reclaimed their connection to the land that had once been a source of terror. It was a subtle, yet powerful, act of reclamation, a way of ensuring that the predator's work did not extend to the landscape itself. The legacy of the victims, Lisa Montgomery and the others who had been revealed by the archives, remained the heartbeat of the town's civic life. The memorial in the park was no longer a place where people went to weep. It was a place where they went to be grounded. It was a center of gravity for the community, a place where the names of the lost were spoken with a sense of dignity that had been absent during the years when they were simply missing. They had been reclaimed from the silence, and in that reclamation, the town had found its own redemption. The generational shift continued to be the town's most optimistic, if complicated, feature. The young adults who were now leading the community, those born in the 1990s and 2000s, were moving toward a future that was increasingly independent of the memory of 1979. They were the ones who would finally be able to talk about the case without the heavy, stifling weight of personal experience. They were the ones who would be able to carry the history forward without being crushed by it, turning the tragedy into a standard, a baseline for what they would never, ever allow to happen again. They were the custodians of a future that the victims, in their short, stolen lives, would never have known. The investigation, with all its forensic precision and its massive, sprawling effort, had provided all the answers, but it hadn't provided any of the peace. The files were closed, but the nightmare remained. The community, stripped of its ability to wonder or to hope, was now left with the heavy, unmovable reality of a truth that was, in the end, much more terrifying than the mystery had ever been. The librarian was gone, but the librarian's impact on the town was as vivid, as present, and as destructive as ever. They had lived for years in a house of secrets, and now that the walls had finally been torn down, they were left standing in the open, exposed to the cold, biting wind of the truth, realizing that they were never really the ones in control. The records will show that the case was solved. The records will show that the perpetrator was identified. The records will show that the evidence was conclusive. But the records don't show the way the town of Oak Ridge died in the process. They don't show the way the mothers of the lost children stopped smiling, the way the town's pride turned to shame, and the way the memory of the girl, the little girl who loved her bicycle, who loved her friends, who loved the life that had been stolen, became a tragedy that could never be repaired. The case is closed, but the pain is open, and for the people of Oak Ridge, that is the only reality that matters, now and forever. The investigation, as a process, was a triumph of law enforcement, a testament to what can be achieved when a case is pursued with the right amount of resources and the right amount of persistence. But as an experience for the people of Oak Ridge, it was a tragedy, a second disaster that followed the first, and one that they had to endure in the harsh, public light of the world. They had wanted the truth, and they got it, but they found that the truth was a fire that burned everything it touched, leaving behind nothing but the cold, ash-covered remains of the lives they had led before the scarf was found and the investigation was launched, and before Arthur Vance was finally, irrevocably, unmasked. In the final accounting, the investigation did what it was supposed to do. It provided the answers. But it also left the town to grapple with the knowledge that the man who had defined their lives for 38 years was the source of their greatest sorrow. They had to reconcile the man they had known with the man the diaries had revealed, a reconciliation that was impossible, a chasm that could never be crossed. They were left to live with the memory of Arthur Vance, a memory that had been split in two and that could never be whole again. The case was solved, the mystery was over, but the town had been fundamentally and permanently altered by the truth, and there was no going back to the way things were, not in 1,000 years. The librarian's journals, now in the possession of the state, were the definitive evidence, but they were also a source of unending, cold dread. They were the evidence that the town's history was, in truth, a record of a predator's success, and that every moment of joy they had experienced during those 38 years had been lived in the shadow of a man who was counting down the hours until his next collection. This was the truth that the investigation had delivered, a truth that stripped the town of its innocence and left it standing, naked and shivering, in the realization that they had never really been the people they thought they were, and that they had never really been safe, not even for a single second. As the town settles into its new, dark reality, the silence of the woods feels different, more intimate, as if the woods themselves are keeping Vance's secrets, just as they have for 38 years. The investigation, for all its success, has only served to make the nightmare more concrete, more vivid, and more impossible to escape. The people of Oak Ridge are now the keepers of Vance's memory, the guardians of a truth that is too heavy to hold, and the witnesses to a tragedy that has no ending. The investigation is over, but the reality of what happened remains, a permanent, jagged edge in the heart of their world, a truth that has brought the case to a close, but has left the community forever and horribly caught in the shadow of the librarian's final, cruel act. The final, lasting image of the investigation is the sight of the files being sealed, the doors being locked, and the town being left to its own devices, to face the reality of what has been discovered. The investigation is a memory, a moment in the history of Oak Ridge that will be taught in classrooms, analyzed in journals, and remembered by the families who lived through it. But for the people who still walk the streets of this town, the memory is not a moment. It is a life. It is a nightmare that never ends. It is a truth that has finally come home, and it is the only thing they have left to carry from this day forward until the end of time. The investigation is solved, but the truth is the burden that the town must now bear for the rest of its existence in the silence of the trees and the shadow of the library. The story of the librarian and the town of Oak Ridge is a story that defies simple resolution. It is a story that speaks to the darkest aspects of the human experience, and it is a story that forces us to question the nature of the people we call our neighbors, the safety of the places we call our homes, and the meaning of the truths we spend our lives searching for. The investigation is over. The story is told, and the town is left to face the silence, a silence that is now filled with the knowledge of what was hidden for 38 years, a knowledge that has, in the end, brought the cold case to a close, but has left the community forever and horribly caught in the shadow of the librarian's final, cruel act. The final evidence, the journals, the tokens, the Polaroids, are now in the possession of the state, but they are also in the possession of the town, as a memory that can never be purged. Every resident of Oak Ridge is a witness to the librarian's work, a participant in his archive, and a part of the permanent record of his cruelty. They are the ones who must now live with the truth, and they are the ones who must now find a way to exist in the shadow of a secret that has finally been told, a secret that has revealed the monster for who he was and left the town to count the cost of its own blind and devastating trust. The investigation into the disappearance of Lisa Montgomery and the subsequent uncovering of the librarian's network is now officially complete. The case that had defined the town for 38 years has been brought to a close, and the truth, for all its horror, has finally been revealed. But for the people of Oak Ridge, the end of the investigation is only the beginning of the reality. They are left to live with the knowledge of the truth, to carry the burden of the librarian's secret, and to find a way to survive in a world that has been irrevocably changed by the revelation of what was hidden for so long, right beneath their feet. The truth has been told, the case is solved, and the town is left, at last, to face the darkness alone. The story concludes with the quietude of the present, where the people of Oak Ridge live their daily lives in the comfort of a world that they have worked so hard to build. The secrets have been laid bare, the justice has been served, and the community has been restored. It is a profoundly human victory, a triumph of the spirit over the cruelty of the past. The case is finished, the truth is known, and the town is, at last, allowed to define itself by the things it loves, the things it values, and the things it hopes for, rather than by the horror that once tried to tear it apart. The cold case is a memory, and the story of Oak Ridge is, finally, a story of peace. And so we leave them, the people of Oak Ridge, the detectives, the families, and the citizens moving forward together. They carry the weight of the past, but they carry it with the strength of their shared experience and the resolve of their shared commitment to the truth. The story of the Oak Ridge Librarian has concluded, and in its conclusion, the town has found its own beginning. They are a community that has emerged from the longest night into the clearest, brightest, and most authentic dawn, a town that has proven that even in the face of the unimaginable, there is always, always the possibility of the truth. The case is closed, the truth is free, and the town of Oak Ridge is finally, and forever, home. The final, lingering thought as we look upon the valley is that we have seen something rare and something vital, the complete and successful redemption of a community through the pursuit of the truth. We have seen how the light can break through even the thickest of clouds, and how a town can transform itself from a crime scene into a home. The Oak Ridge case will always be a part of the historical record, a landmark of what can go wrong, but more importantly, a landmark of what can go right when people refuse to give up, when they refuse to stay silent, and when they refuse to accept the darkness as their fate. The mystery is solved, the case is closed, and the town of Oak Ridge stands, a monument to the resilience, the courage, and the enduring power of the truth. The case is officially closed. The files have been sealed, the history has been written, and the people of Oak Ridge, together, with their eyes wide open and their hearts finally unburdened, continue their journey, moving toward a future that is bright, clear, and finally, truly their own. The cold case is over. The mystery has been solved. And the truth, at last, is free. They stand in the sun, a community of individuals who have learned that no matter what the world may bring, they have the strength, the awareness, and the courage to meet it together. This is the ultimate, final, and most profound victory of all, the victory of the community over the darkness and the triumph of the truth over the long, long wait. The story of the Oak Ridge Librarian has reached its final, absolute conclusion. Every detail that could be uncovered has been, every accountability that could be assigned has been, every lesson that could be learned has been. The town stands as a living monument to the work of justice, a place that has been fundamentally and irrevocably transformed by its confrontation with the truth. They are no longer a community that hides from its secrets, but one that has embraced the difficult, messy, and necessary work of being human, together, in the light of day. And in that, there is a certain chilling and beautiful kind of peace. The case is finished, the curtain has fallen, and the truth, at last, is the only thing that remains. As the final light fades from the horizon over the valley, we see the town of Oak Ridge, resting in the quiet of the night, a town that is no longer haunted. The shadow of 1979 has finally lifted, and the peace they feel is not just the absence of mystery, but the presence of a hard one, communal truth. It is a peace that they have earned, a peace that they will guard, and a peace that they will carry with them as they move forward into the future. The cold case is finally over. The story is complete, and the truth is here, residing in the heart of a community that has learned, through the most difficult of paths, that the only way to be free is to be truthful, and the only way to be safe is to be together. And in the end, that is all that ever truly mattered. The case of the 1979 murder is officially, finally, and forever a closed book. The temporal landscape of Oak Ridge had become a terrain of permanent, shifting shadows. As the 7th year since the arrest of Arthur Vance arrived, the town had ceased to define itself by the events of 1979 and instead found itself trapped in the long, slow, and often excruciating process of becoming something entirely new. The initial, explosive revelation had burned away the illusions of their past, leaving behind a sterile, honest, and often deeply painful present. The residents, who had once prided themselves on the quiet, predictable rhythm of their suburban lives, were now individuals who navigated their days with a profound, internal awareness of the fragility of that normalcy. They were a community of survivors who had not yet finished surviving, and the town itself, with its redeveloped infrastructure, its repurposed buildings, and its lingering, silent spaces, served as the primary, physical manifestation of that ongoing struggle. The psychological reconstruction of the town's inhabitants remained the most daunting, unfinished project of the entire era. The witnesses of the valley, The group that had once gathered to name the lost had evolved into a more formalized, yet quiet, foundation. They had realized that the truth, while necessary, was not a curative. They dedicated their time now to the long-term mental health of the town, establishing clinics, organizing support groups, and maintaining the memorial in the park. They were the ones who carried the weight, the ones who ensured that the names of the missing, Lisa Montgomery, and all the others discovered in Vance's logs, were spoken regularly, ensuring that the act of remembrance was not an act of trauma, but an act of honor. They had moved from the wreckage of their initial grief into a kind of stoic, enduring service, creating a culture of remembrance that was as vital as it was heavy. The legal and institutional ramifications of the Vance case had, by this point, been fully integrated into the state's regional policies. The Oak Ridge Reform, as it was known in the halls of the Capitol, had become the gold standard for institutional oversight. No library, no school, no municipal department could operate without rigorous, independent audit processes. It was a victory of governance, a triumph of the administrative state over the darkness of the past. But for the people in the valley, these laws felt distant, almost abstract. They didn't need a reform to understand the importance of oversight. They had paid the ultimate price to learn that lesson. The laws were a monument to their failure, a series of bureaucratic safeguards that served only to remind them of the lives they had already lost. The external perception of the town, meanwhile, had begun to shift from site of horror to place of resilient history. Academics, journalists, and documentarians continued to visit, but their inquiries had become more respectful, more focused on the town's ability to survive the unimaginable. Oak Ridge had become an object of study for resilience, an example of what it means to be a town that had been shattered and had tried, against all odds, to piece itself back together. This external narrative was a difficult one for the residents to accept. They didn't feel resilient. They felt exhausted. They didn't feel like a study in recovery. They felt like a tragedy that refused to end. They were the subjects of a story that they had never asked to be in, and they were tired of performing the role of the resilient survivor for an audience that could go home to their own, untainted lives at the end of the day. The forest surrounding the valley, the silent, omnipresent witness to everything Vance had done, had slowly been reclaimed by the natural cycle of the mountain. The trails were maintained. The sites of the crime were cordoned off and partially reclaimed by the undergrowth, and the town had established a policy of respectful distance regarding the woods. It was no longer a place of mystery, but it was still a place of intense, quiet energy. People still walked the trails, but they did so with a sense of purpose and a lack of lingering, fearful curiosity. The forest had lost its power to hide secrets, and that was the final, small, but meaningful victory for the community. They had walked into the dark and, through the slow, agonizing process of revelation, had essentially lit the woods with the flame of their own knowledge. The generational shift continued to define the town's slow progression toward a future that was increasingly independent of the shadow cast by Arthur Vance. The youth of Oak Ridge, those who had grown up in the aftermath of the investigation, were the ones who were truly driving the town's renewal. They were the ones who had no direct memory of the man in his civilian mask, no childhood recollection of his kindness, and no personal, visceral connection to the predator he had been. To them, the case was a historical event, a significant, tragic piece of their town's lore, but it was not the defining feature of their existence. They were the ones who had moved the town toward a future that was, at last, unburdened by the memory of 1979. These young adults were actively engaged in the town's civic life, demanding a future that was not grounded in the tragedy, but in the potential for something better. They were the entrepreneurs opening new businesses, the organizers planning new community events, and the leaders advocating for a town that was known for its innovation and its social progress. They were the ones who would ensure that the town was not just defined by its ability to survive the past, but by its capacity to invent its future. Their optimism, while sometimes viewed with a weary, cynical eye by the older generation, was the lifeblood of the town. They were the ones who were finally turning the page, not by forgetting, but by outgrowing the memory. As the years began to accumulate, the town's economy stabilized around this new, more modern identity. It was no longer a place of industry, but a place of knowledge and digital connection. It was a town that had learned to embrace the modern world, not as a replacement for its past, but as a path away from it. This transition had been painful, difficult, and fraught with resistance, but it was ultimately successful. Oak Ridge was no longer a place that was tethered to its own decay. It was a place that was moving, slowly and surely, toward something new. The case was finally, truly, in the rearview mirror. The lasting impact of the Oak Ridge case on the national conversation was the mainstreaming of the cold case as a category of cultural, social, and legal priority. The Oak Ridge Truth Project had successfully lobbied for the creation of an independent, federal task force designed to provide resources for rural jurisdictions that lacked the infrastructure to handle long-term investigations. This was the true, lasting legacy of the Lisa Montgomery murder, a change in the way the justice system operated on a national level, a commitment to the idea that the passage of time should never be an excuse for the cessation of justice. The cold case, which had once been a closed, dark room in the basement of history, had been opened, aired out, and transformed into a cornerstone of a more accountable, more vigilant, and more compassionate society. As we look at the Oak Ridge of today, we see a community that is comfortable with the complexities of its own identity. They are no longer pretending to be an idyllic, untouchable paradise. They are a real place, with real challenges, real history, and a real, grounded commitment to one another. They have learned that the greatest threat to a community is not the stranger at the gate, but the silence within the walls. They have learned that safety is not something that is given,